In this episode, we pause and do a fast but meaningful reset on Domain 2, because this is the stretch where many new learners start to feel like everything is blending together. Domain 2 is the risk-centered domain, and it asks you to think like someone who can recognize risk, measure it, and reduce it in a repeatable way. That includes understanding the risk lifecycle, identifying threats that matter for AI systems, choosing testing approaches that reveal weaknesses, and managing vendor risk when someone else is part of your system. A quick review does not mean shallow coverage, because the point is to lock in the connections between ideas so you can recall them easily later. The goal here is to make Domain 2 feel like one coherent story, where each task builds on the previous one and supports the decisions you make in real organizations. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. The first anchor concept is the risk lifecycle, which is simply the idea that risk is not a single moment. Risk starts when something valuable exists, like data, systems, or decisions, and something could harm it, like mistakes, attacks, or unexpected behavior. You identify risk by describing what could go wrong and what the impact would be if it did. You assess risk by estimating likelihood and impact, even if those estimates are rough, because they help you prioritize. You treat risk by choosing controls, accepting some risks, avoiding others, or transferring some through arrangements like insurance or contracts. Then you monitor and review risk because conditions change, and a risk that was small can become large if the system changes, threats evolve, or controls drift. If you remember nothing else, remember that risk management is a loop, not a checklist, and the loop is what keeps AI governance alive over time. Within that lifecycle, Domain 2 asks you to recognize that AI systems have some special risk features. These systems can change behavior when the model is updated, when new data influences outputs, or when users interact in unexpected ways. AI can also create risk through scale, because the same model can impact many decisions quickly, and an error can replicate across thousands of outputs. Another feature is opacity, because even when a system seems to work, it may be hard to explain exactly why a certain output occurred. Those features do not replace classic cybersecurity concerns, but they add new layers to them. When you manage risk for AI, you are managing both the security of the system and the safety of its behavior, and Domain 2 keeps returning to that dual focus. Threats are the next major piece, and the simplest way to understand them is to separate intent from impact. Some threats are intentional, like attackers trying to steal data, manipulate outputs, or disrupt services. Other threats are unintentional, like poor data quality, broken integrations, misconfiguration, or human misunderstanding of what the model can do. Domain 2 encourages you to think broadly, because a risk does not need a villain to be real. A model can leak sensitive information because of how it was trained, or because prompts and logs are handled carelessly, even if no one is trying to break it. When you identify threats, you are trying to build a realistic picture of what pressures the system faces, including adversaries, accidents, and complexity. A helpful connection for new learners is that threats become meaningful when they are linked to assets. An asset is anything you care about protecting, such as training data, model weights, prompts, outputs, user identities, or the availability of the service. If you can name the asset, you can ask what could compromise confidentiality, integrity, or availability for that asset. In AI, you also add a safety lens, asking what could cause harmful or misleading outputs, unfair outcomes, or privacy violations. Domain 2 tasks push you to keep this asset-first mindset so you do not get lost in random threat lists. The best threat analysis stays grounded in what your organization is actually using and what could actually be harmed. Testing is the next pillar, and it sits in the risk lifecycle as a way to validate assumptions and discover weaknesses before they become incidents. Testing is not only for mature teams. Even beginners can understand the purpose of testing as a reality check. If you think a control works, testing asks you to show evidence that it works under realistic conditions. That might mean evaluating how the system handles misuse, whether access restrictions hold under pressure, whether logging catches important events, and whether a model behaves safely across edge cases. Testing also helps you discover unexpected failure modes, especially in AI, where outputs can be surprising even when everything is functioning normally. Domain 2 emphasizes that testing should be planned, repeatable, and tied to risk, rather than random probing that creates noise. It is also important to recall the difference between types of testing, not as a list, but as an idea of depth and focus. Some testing checks compliance with requirements, such as whether controls exist and are documented. Other testing checks operational behavior, such as how the system responds to stress, changes, or malicious inputs. In AI, testing can include safety-oriented checks that look for harmful outputs, data exposure, or inconsistency across similar inputs. A key beginner takeaway is that testing is not an admission that you expect failure. It is a professional practice that assumes no system is perfect and that learning early is cheaper than learning during a crisis. Testing supports the risk lifecycle because it informs assessment, strengthens treatment choices, and provides evidence for monitoring. Vendor risk ties everything together because vendors can affect every part of the lifecycle. If a vendor hosts your model, they influence availability and incident response. If a vendor provides training data, they influence integrity and bias risk. If a vendor offers an AI service through an API, they influence security controls you cannot see directly. Domain 2 tasks related to vendors remind you that you cannot outsource responsibility, even when you outsource technology. You still need to know what the vendor controls, what you control, and what evidence proves the vendor is meeting expectations. Vendor risk is not about distrust. It is about acknowledging that your risk depends on another organization's decisions and that you need visibility into those decisions. Monitoring vendors is one Domain 2 focus because controls can drift. Evidence, updates, and incident notifications are the key signals you use to stay informed. Evidence tells you whether controls exist and operate. Updates tell you what is changing that might alter risk, and incident notifications tell you when something has gone wrong that could affect you. Verification is another focus because you cannot rely on monitoring alone. Audits and tests provide structured assurance, and contract enforcement gives you leverage to require remediation, transparency, and timely communication. If you connect these ideas, you see a consistent pattern. Monitoring is ongoing awareness, verification is proof, and enforcement is what makes expectations meaningful. Another crucial Domain 2 idea is that all of these practices are about decision-making, not paperwork. Risk management is only valuable when it changes what you do, such as which controls you implement, which vendors you select, how you configure data access rules, or when you decide to pause a rollout. Threat analysis is valuable when it shapes priorities, such as focusing on protecting prompts and logs because they contain sensitive context, or focusing on identity controls because they prevent misuse of powerful features. Testing is valuable when it reveals gaps early and leads to fixes rather than being filed away. Vendor oversight is valuable when it reduces unknowns and ensures that when incidents happen, you are not scrambling to understand basic facts. Domain 2 is essentially training you to make better choices under uncertainty. A common mistake for beginners is to treat Domain 2 as separate topics to memorize instead of one system. The risk lifecycle gives you the flow, threats give you the pressures, testing gives you evidence, and vendor management extends your view beyond your own walls. When you see the connections, recall becomes easier because each concept cues the next. If you remember the lifecycle, you will remember that identification and assessment lead to treatment, and treatment requires controls, and controls require testing and monitoring. If you remember vendors, you will remember that evidence and audits connect to verification, and updates connect to monitoring, and contracts connect to enforcement. Domain 2 becomes a story about keeping risk real, measurable, and continuously managed. Another important connection is how Domain 2 supports governance without needing you to be a specialist. Governance sounds big, but at a beginner level it means clear decisions, clear responsibility, and clear evidence that expectations are being met. Domain 2 gives governance its facts, because governance decisions should be based on risk understanding, not intuition or marketing. When you can articulate risk, recognize threats, request meaningful tests, and verify vendor controls, you are supporting governance even if you never write a policy yourself. This is why Domain 2 is so central to AI security management. It builds the mindset that security is not a one-time build, but a continuous balance between value and risk. As you close this review, keep Domain 2 in your head as a loop that never stops turning. The risk lifecycle describes the rhythm of identifying, assessing, treating, and monitoring risk as AI systems change. Threats are the reasons that loop matters, because they represent both adversaries and ordinary failure conditions. Testing is how you replace assumptions with evidence, so your controls are not just theoretical. Vendors are the reality check that much of your AI environment may be outside your direct control, so you need verification and enforcement, not just trust. If you can say those relationships out loud and explain them simply, you have the core of tasks 4 through 9 in a way that will stay with you.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.